The good clergyman shook his head. "It is a most natural question, my dear young friend. Allow me to so call you. All are my friends who feel upon this subject as you appear to do. It is a most natural and most obvious question. Yet would my reply be anything rather than easy of comprehension were I to attempt to answer it directly. I sincerely hope I shall converse with you again on this subject. Documents are not wanting, my dear Brotherton, to prove that all, or nearly all, that private individuals can do in the way of petition and remonstrance has been already tried, nor are we yet without hope that good may come of it. But it must be long, and perhaps the longer the better, ere your young head and innocent heart can conceive our difficulties. You would hardly believe the ingenious devices to which frightened avarice can have recourse in order to retard, mutilate, and render abortive a measure for having its object a reduction of profits, with no equivalent save the beholding smiles instead of tears, and hearing the sounds of song and laughter instead of groans. But while you are still waiting and hoping for this aid from our lawgivers, said Mary, is there nothing that can be done in the interval to help all this misery, Mr. Bell? Nothing effectual, my dear young lady, he replied mournfully. I may with no dishonest boasting say that my life is spent in doing all I can to save these unhappy people from utter degradation and despair. But the oppression under which they groan is too overwhelming to be removed, or even lightened, by any agency less powerful than that of the law. Nothing, in fact, can so clearly show the powerful oppression of the system as the total inefficiency of individual benevolence to heal the misery of those who suffer under it. Its power is stupendous, awful, terrible. Nature herself, elsewhere so omnipotent, here feels the strength of unchecked human wickedness, and seems to bend before it. For most certain it is, that in less than half a century, during which the present factory system has been in operation, the lineaments of the race involved in it are changed and deteriorated. The manufacturing population are of lesser and weaker growth than their agricultural countrymen. The development of the intellectual faculties is obviously becoming weaker, and many whom we have every reason to believe understand the physiology of man as thoroughly as science can teach it to them, do not scruple to assert that if the present system continues, the race of English factory operatives will dwindle and sink in the strongly graduated scales of human beings to something lower than the Esquimaux. Gracious heavens! Cried Mary, clasping her hands with an emotion that almost amounted to agony. And these horrors are perpetrated for the sake of making rich, needlessly, uselessly rich, a few obscure manufacturing families like my own. This is very dreadful, sir, she continued, while tears burst from her eyes. I have gained knowledge, but not peace, by my visit, and I must leave you with the sad conviction that the hopes I had nourished of making my fortune useful to the suffering creatures among whom I live is vain and idle. Mr. Bell listened to this melancholy assertion, and sighed because he could not contradict it. Yes, he said at length, it is even so, and if any proof were wanted of the depth and hopelessness of the wretchedness which the present system produces, it might be found in the fact that despite the inclination I feel both for your sake and that of the poor operatives to encourage your generous benevolence, I cannot in conscience tell you that it is in your power effectively to assist them, that you may save your own excellent heart from the palsy of hopelessness and helpless pity by the indulgence of your benevolence in individual cases of distress, I need not point out to you, but that of any ordinary modes of being useful on a larger scale, such as organizing schools, founding benefit societies, or the like, could be of any use to being so crushed, so toil-worn, and so degraded, it would be an idle hope. Miss Brotherton now rose to depart, but as she extended her hand and began to utter her farewell, it occurred to her that it was possible her new friend might, by conjecture at least, throw some light upon the destination of little Mchl, and avoiding as much as possible the making of any direct charge against her rich neighbour, she briefly narrated the facts of Michel's adoption, dismissal, and unknown destination, with little commentary on either, but concluded by saying, the mother of the child is in great anxiety about him, and though I cannot conceive it is possible any harm can have befallen the boy, I am in some in some sort of fellow sufferer with her in the anxiety which this mystery occasions, from having almost pledged myself to learn the place of his destination. Can you, dear sir, suggest to me any means by which this information can be obtained? Some part of this history has reached us already, replied Mr. Bell. It has been somewhat industriously bruited through the neighbourhood that Sir Matthew Dowling, notoriously one of the most tyrannical millocrats in the whole district, has been moved to kindness in behalf of some poor widow's son, and taken him to be reared and educated with his own children. I trust I am excusable, knowing what I know, for misdoubting the disinterested benevolence of any act of Sir Matthew Dowling's. Nevertheless, it is certainly not easy to perceive why, after having so ostentatiously distinguished the boy, he should kidnap him, as it were, from his own house in order to get rid of him, if, instead of being the object of a special favour, the little fellow has fallen under the rich knight's displeasure, Miss Brotherton. I should think it by no means improbable that he might have consigned him as an apprentice to some establishment too notorious for its severity to make it desirable that his selection of it should be made known. But of all this there seems neither proof nor likelihood. Miss Brotherton turned pale as she listened to this suggestion. Nay, but there is both truth and likelihood in such a suspicion, she exclaimed with considerable emotion, and after a moment's consideration added, I know no reason why I should conceal the cause I have for saying so. If you know not all, how can you give me counsel? Hurriedly, and as briefly as possible, Miss Brotherton then recounted the scene she had witnessed in the green room of the Dowling Lodge theatrics. But there was an unconscious and involuntary fever in her manner of narrating it, which rendered it impossible to listen with indifference, or not to feel at the recital some portion of the indignation she had felt when it had occurred. It must be looked to, Miss Brotherton, replied her warm-hearted new acquaintance. The boy must be traced, tracked, found, and rescued. I think there are few of these wretched prisons of whose existence I am ignorant, and it is possible I may be able to help you in this. Should I obtain any hint likely to be useful in the search, I will call upon you, if you will give me leave, to communicate it. Most earnestly and truly did the heiress assure him that it was impossible she should receive a visit more calculated to give her pleasure, adding that whether the hint were obtained or not, she trusted her acquaintance that had she so unceremoniously began, would not drop here, and that, by returning her visit, he would prove to her that he was not displeased by it. It rarely happens between right-hearted people who meet for the first time, if one of the parties conceives a liking for the other, that it fails to prove mutual, and it was with a cordial sincerity, as genuine as her own, that Mr. Bell expressed his hope that their acquaintance would ripen into friendship. Too intently occupied by all that had passed to remember her own arrangements, Mary forgot that her carriage was not at the door, and while these parting words were exchanged, walked forth, expecting to find it. It was Miss Tremlett who first recollected that the coachman had been ordered to put up his horses at the nearest inn, but this was not till they had traversed the little garden, and were already in the lane, for though the good nurse had been little more than a personage muet during the foregoing scene, she had taken a deep interest in it, and it was with the air of one awakened from a dream that she said, My dear Miss Mary, you have forgot that the carriage is sent away. Indeed I have, said Mary, laughing, and no wonder, but there stands our faithful William. He will tell us in what direction we may find it. Will you not return, Miss Brotherton, while it is made ready? Said the clergyman. Not if you will walk on with us, dear sir. The evening is delightful, but already quite far enough advanced to make it prudent not to lose any time. And having given orders that the carriage was to follow, they strolled on towards the turnpike. There, said Mr. Bell, pointing to the towering chimneys of a large factory at some distance, there, Miss Brotherton, is an establishment where, though carding and spinning go on within the walls, and some hundreds of children and young girls are employed in attending the machinery that performs the process, the voice of misery is never heard, for there the love of gold is chained and held captive by religion and humanity. Thank God! Exclaimed Mary, as she looked at the sinless monster to which he pointed. It is not of necessity, then, that this dangerous trade is fatal to all employed in it. Certainly not. Were but its labours restricted both for young and old to 10 hours a day, there is no reason on earth why it should not be carried on with comfort and advantage to every individual concerned in it, and with credit, honour, and prosperity to the country. But you can hardly guess what uphill work it is when one good man has got to stand alone and breast the competition of the whole host of bad ones in his commercial enterprises. The high-minded owners of yonder factory are losing thousands every year by their efforts to purify this trade of its enormities, and some thousand small, still voices call down blessings on them for it. But while it costs them 10 shillings to produce what their neighbours can bring to the market for 9, they will only be pointed at as pitiably unwise in their generation by all the great families of mammon which surround them. Few, alas, will think of following the example. All they can do, therefore, is in fact but carry on a system of private charity on an enormous scale. But till they are supported by law, even their vast efforts and most noble sacrifices can do nothing towards the general redemption of our poor northern people from the state of slavery into which they have fallen. And yet I do believe, Miss Brotherton, he continued after a pause, I do most truly believe that these greedy tyrants would fail more rarely than now they do in their efforts to realize enormous wealth if the system were to undergo exactly the change we ask for. The plan of underselling may indeed in some few instances enable a very lucky man to run up a blood-stained fortune, and blood-stained it must be, for whenever this method of commanding a sale is pursued and ruin does not ensue, it is demonstrable that the bones and marrows of children, working unlimited hours, must have been the main agent in the operation. But it is quite certain that the underselling system must upon the long run be ruinous, if all the losses upon our production were fairly set against all the gains from the immoderate working of young hands. The slavery scheme would appear as little profitable as wholly. But here is your carriage, my dear young lady. God bless you, and may we live to rejoice together over an effectual legislative remedy for the evils we have passed this our first interview in deploring. So saying, he extended his hand to assist her into the carriage, which had already drawn up beside them. But Miss Brotherton stepped aside while he performed this office to her friend, and then, laying her hand upon his arm, drew him back a step or two to the spot from whence the factory chimneys had pointed out to her were visible. "Tell me, before we part," she said, "the names of those whom that building belongs." "Wood and Walker," replied the clergyman. "Thank you," she replied. "I shall never hear those names without breathing a blessing on them." Friendly farewells were at once exchanged, and the meditative heiress was driven back to Milford Park in silence so profound that her old friend believed her to be asleep, and carefully abstained from any movements that might awaken her. But Mary Brotherton was not asleep.